moment, in a world with neither obvious heroes nor villains, but mostly shades of grey, we have to stay focused on the long game. When Cyril Ramaphosa took office, he promised a new dawn. But of course, I think even he knew that this was going to be a really uphill battle. He has inherited a hot mess. I won't go into the details of all of it, but they're familiar to all of you in the audience. State-owned enterprises, state capture, SARS, and one could go on. And so no matter how many times Ramaphosa summons the better angels of our nature and encourages us to say, tu mamina, we all knew that it was going to be tough to rebuild our economy and a social compact which is dangerously fraying at the seams. At the 100-day mark of the presidency, the media and others were starting to feel the urge to somehow measure it. Our public discourse, and indeed discourse around the world, could do with that rare commodity, restraint. As we try to grapple with race, with issues of land, with the triple challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, how to change our public spaces and the nature of life along our highways and byways, we need to restrain ourselves from the immediacy of the quick fix. Somehow we need to seek ways to balance both affect and reason in the public debate. Easy slogans about decolonization, white monopoly capital, taking back the land, and white tears will only lead to the cul-de-sac of thought that we have seen thus far. Track the presidency we must. Hold the Ramaphosa presidency to account we must. But there is an urgent need to take the long view. And it may not satisfy the slogan-filled politics of populism, but it is necessary if we are going to think carefully about an inclusive democracy. The next struggle, I believe, is finding the Constitution again. Undergirding the values of the Constitution is our next struggle. It is one which pits those who would destroy the state for their own narrow gain directly against those who seek to build a country where those in power are accountable and responsive to the citizenry. There are several challenges which remain as we seek to entrench rights and the supremacy of the Constitution, which seems to be becoming an increasingly contested terrain. It's become fashionable to question the 1994 constitutional and negotiated settlement. And so I believe we need to go back to the beginning. For me, the starting point always is the Constitution. It represents the framework around which everything else pivots. And despite the criticism of the Constitution, it's been much maligned by the very ANC, a faction of the ANC, that fought for its adoption and was deeply involved in its writing process. To me, it remains the lodestar, the aspirational document our founding fathers and mothers intended. It has its faults, but in essence, it provides a framework to bring about socioeconomic equality. But any constitution, and this is the challenge for us today, can only be as effective as the men and women who are charged with implementing the country's rules, but also all of us who need to demand the accountability from public representatives. And the question that is often asked is, tomorrow, if the Constitution was scrapped, who would march in its defense? What would all of us in this room do? That we have strayed so far from the ideal and that inequality has risen so dramatically is not the fault of the Constitution. It has not failed us in providing the necessary space for transformation and the guidelines for a state which is accountable. In the unanimous judgment of the Constitutional Court in the Nkandla matter, Chief Justice Mogoeng eloquently outlined what kind of state the Constitution envisages. He said accountability, the rule of law, and the supremacy of the Constitution are crucial. He went on to state how this applies to all public representatives, including the President. He says, for this reason, public office bearers ignore their constitutional obligations at their peril. This is so because constitutionalism, accountability, and the rule of law constitute the sharp and mighty sword that stands ready to chop the ugly head of impunity off its stiffened neck. And that's very vivid language by our Chief Justice, and we've become used to that. But it's a stark reminder of the promise of the Constitution and aspects which remain still unfulfilled. During the Fees Must Fall protests and beyond, the argument against the Constitution was repeated. Somehow the Constitution has been scapegoated in this process. The arguments against the Constitution that I heard during that time went something like this. White people have had everything. Black people entered a compromise so whites could keep just about everything and hand black people scraps off the table. It's a sloppy analysis, not all untrue, that doesn't take into account the global and political context of the time sketched above, and doesn't truly engage with many of the deeply progressive constitutional judgments which have been handed down since 1996. Yet it can be compelling in a populist way. Former Constitutional Court Judge Albie Sachs, and struggle stalwart, offers a powerful counter-narrative, and I believe the counter-narratives are important. He tells of the internal debate within the ANC and how the principled leadership of O.R. Tambo supporting the concept of a Bill of Rights when the moment arose. Tambo was set upon constitutionalizing aspects of the struggle, and in Sachs's words, learning from every source and widening the embrace of the ANC as a movement and in its thinking. Tambo's and the ANC's strategic position on the Bill of Rights was that it would exist to, quote unquote, protect everyone, black and white, rich and poor, in Sachs's words. The Constitution itself was needed as protection against arbitrariness by all leaders, and indeed, as Sachs said, to be used against ourselves. That was in 1988. Admittedly, it's often difficult to hear people like Sachs and their reasonableness above the noise of now. So the Constitution might not provide all of the answers, but it does provide us with a guide. And it would be a pity then if in questioning and having a debate about the content and outcome of our negotiated settlement, if the Constitution becomes collateral damage. It is crucial to understand how we arrived at the Constitution and why it is at the bedrock of our society. What is often forgotten is the road we have traveled and the respect we need to have for those early and difficult decisions that Nelson Mandela in particular and other members of the ANC had to make as South Africa stared down the edge of the abyss. And so this difficult political and social moment that we're in requires measured interventions from leaders across society if we are to change the status quo and achieve dignity for all. And so in the midst of these arguments, sometimes our dialogue becomes confused. Sometimes even violence, burning, and the calls for everything to fall. Yet if something falls, what rises in its place? And if things burn, who will rebuild? So given the challenges of the present, where exactly should our focus lie in fashioning this post-Zuma democracy? A democracy in which, and this was a working definition of democracy that we always used when I worked at the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. A democracy in which, a country in which we enable citizens to build popular, accountable, and sustainable self-government and enjoy equality with each other in governance processes. Our society now, more than ever, is in need of critical voices on every front as it continues the battle to find its soul. And how do we forge a society which raises leaders who are capable of what Njibula and Ndebele once called counterintuitive leadership? This, I would argue, takes us beyond the ANC and President Ramaphosa and any other political party. It is reimagining a quite different South Africa. And there are a number of areas that I believe we should be focusing on if we are to create a sustainable democracy and take advantage of this window of opportunity that I believe we have. In many ways, we are finding our collective voice again. The one thing that I believe Ahmed Kathrada would not have wanted was for us to throw our hands up in despair and give up. I would argue also that it's not who we are as a people. If my work at Adasa and elsewhere on democracy building has shown anything, it is that democracy is a journey, not an event, marathon, not sprint. But there's some key ingredients that we need to have. The first is education, education, education. And clearly, post-apartheid South Africa's greatest failure has been our education system, despite the fact that we have spent more on education as a proportion of GDP than in other areas. Too many South African children simply drop out of school before reaching matric, and the annual puff and pose surrounding the matric pass rate is just that, puff, when only 28% of those who passed are able to reach university, not to mention the number of young children who drop out and never see matric. Education is a means of lifting people out of poverty and providing a way out of desperate situations. But in a post-1994 country based on a flawed notion of empowerment, education often takes a back seat in our national discourse, which prizes crass wealth accumulation above the emancipatory power of a decent education. Our post-94 world has been littered with politicians driving German SUVs and a form of empowerment which has not preferred skill or education, but instead has preferred political proximity. President Zuma mocked clever blacks and seemed comfortable with his ignorance. We will also need further investment and serious commitment to proper intellectual pursuit. Education and knowledge must be the cornerstone of any society seeking to build a culture of democracy. It means we need teachers in the classroom. It means greater accountability with regard to that, better infrastructure, proper leadership, principals who can lead. It means that the issues around corruption within the South African Democratic Teachers Union, the buying of posts, which remains unresolved, needs to be resolved. But we also need to focus on enhancing skills, vocational training, FET colleges, and empowering young women to enter universities and focus on language, maths, science. The diagnosis has been done over and over again, but we need to make this happen. Constitutional education, I believe, is a very important part of this. What is the Constitution? What is its purpose? How does it provide the checks and balances on power and give rise to a culture of accountability on top of fine words and institutions? What is Chapter 2 of the what is Chapter 2 of the Constitution? What does it mean when we say socioeconomic rights are justiciable? And what were the cases brought before the court which protected the vulnerable? The culture of accountability, that there are consequences for actions, can only happen in a society where there is knowledge of the Constitution and where citizens demand it. It demands us to have respect for those in authority, but not deference to power. There's been too much of that, I think, in the post-94 South Africa, from seemingly trivial issues like ministers arriving late for functions to the dire recent behavior of ministers like Batabile Dlamini and Malusi Gigaba. Surely they're both unfit for office and must go. Our memories of Zuma laughing it off are still fresh and raw. And then the economy. It is about the economy, stupid, and it has to be fixed. We need to, though, start creating trust between economic players based on an understanding that a fair wage, a proper skills base, artisanship, and entrepreneurship has to be supportive. Some form of shared sacrifice is necessary to deal with the ravages of the past. Some have been calling for an economic codessa to deal with unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Perhaps that is something that we might pursue, who knows? According to the World Bank report released in April and discussed in South Africa, we are the most unequal society in the world. The Ramaphosa presidency has been trying to deal with the economy through the Jobs Summit, through looking at the institutions in a big picture manner, and also through the Youth Employment Service Program, which looks at addressing youth unemployment and encouraging and supporting entrepreneurship. But of course, as Alan Hirsch, the director of the Graduate School of Development Policy and Practice at UCT, reminds us, getting to serious, inclusive economic growth is going to demand a great deal of work by skilled policymakers working within effective social partnership agreements. Hirsch goes on to say that policy certainty is needed about mining, land, and black economic empowerment to encourage new investment. Small business is also crucial as a cog in the wheel of the economy. Much of the red tape surrounding small business creation will have to be cut, and the Ministry of Small Business Development needs to be more efficient in spending what money is allocated to it. In 2017, Minister Lindiwe Zulu failed to spend 140 million rand of her budget, while simultaneously asking for a bigger one. Needless to say, education and understanding is crucial to building a functional and thriving economy. However, it will take a long-term commitment from business, unions, and the state itself. And then thirdly, we need to be connecting the dots via free and independent media. I've spoken earlier about the way in which the State Capture Commission has shone a light on in the dark places. And much of what we are hearing is as a result of excellent investigative journalism. The media hasn't always got it right, and there are areas that one can criticize them for that. But ultimately, we know what we know because of certain tenacious investigative journalists. But it's important that we connect the dots. How does a tender awarded to a politician or one of his or her family manifest in the collapse of public services? And how does it affect the living conditions of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society? This information then needs to be popularized and widely disseminated and advocated upon. And then leadership. I believe our society requires leadership. It's become unfashionable to call for leadership, as it's seen as citizens abdicating responsibility to men and women who know better. But what the recent past has shown is that where you have a lack of leadership or destructive leadership, it has deep consequences for the future. I would argue that the vacuum of leadership in South Africa has exacerbated our dire socioeconomic situation. It has crippled our ability to deal with our challenges. As Naomi Klein says, politics hates a vacuum, and into the vacuum anything and everything falls: hate, fear, ignorance, violence. And so in these times, we must keep on making the argument for greater political accountability and transparency, for better leadership and active citizenship. What are our common values and ideals, and how do we protect and defend those? We think back to the Safu court case where Nelson Mandela was called to testify about his decision to set up a commission of inquiry into, of all things, rugby. Trust South Africa to have a sporting example thrown in there somewhere. That Mandela was prepared to place himself in such a position of scrutiny was a singular act of leadership. It not only showed his commitment to the rule of law and the Constitution, but was a visible reminder that no one, not even the president, was against the law. That was Mandela the constitutionalist and Mandela the leader. Who can forget him going on television to call for calm at the time of Chris Hani's murder? Or Pravin Gordhan, even more lately, at the medium-term budget policy statement a couple of years ago, going out and meeting and facing protesting students. Over the past decade, we have suffered of a lack of leadership and recklessness, and that has affected our society as a whole. Things burn and fall with no wisdom as to what happens next, and words are used too carelessly where leadership vacuum exists. But it's not only in the state that we need to be brave enough to speak proverbial truth to power. It is in business and civil society and wherever we all find ourselves. Equally as in government, those charlatans sit amongst us in business and in our think tanks and NGOs at times. They're not exempt from the lies and deception, and it is our duty to recognize it when we see it. And the last point, which I think is an overarching point that I want to make, is around active and engaged citizenship. These are the ordinary people who question and who do the work of democracy. And that quiet work goes on every day in our country and always makes me hopeful, despite the excesses of power that we hear. It responds to circumstances and necessity, often in the most creative of ways. But it also requires a thoughtfulness on the part of each one of us. How do we respond, and when we do, how do we respond to, and when we do that, to what we see around us? Transformation has become a very tired and overused word, and it is often used as a proxy to advance narrow political interest. Yet the work, and it is work, of transforming our society needs to be done with care, and has been described by Chief Justice Pius Langer in his essay Transformative Constitutionalism as follows. Transformation is a permanent ideal, a way of looking at the world that creates a space in which dialogue and contestation are truly possible, in which new ways of being are constantly explored and created, accepted and rejected, and in which change is unpredictable, but the idea of change is constant. This is perhaps the ultimate vision of a transformative constitution. It envisages a society that will always be open to change and contestation, a society that will always be defined by transformation. But transformation in our society, whether we're active citizens or not, is often difficult because we are weighed down by the anger of both the past and the present. Our dialogue is brittle and blame is apportioned readily and angrily. We seem sometimes not to listen to each other and simply turn up the volume or outshout each other. It's difficult to have a debate on solutions for the future in this context. As Anthea Garman says, South Africa is at a point of rupture with its apartheid past. Accountability is hard because there is a trust deficit created by our past, and the past lies between us in every debate about the economy, about race and class, in every disagreement about structural inequality built on cheap labor. It hampers our ability to find, I believe, creative solutions. And the lack of accountability for past wrongs by those within the apartheid regime has left discomfort in the present. And the danger of it is illustrated by Ankie Krog's extraordinary poem, Country of Grief and Grace, when she says, "But if the old is not guilty, does not confess, then of course the new can also not be guilty, nor be held accountable if it repeats the old. Things may then continue as before, but in a different shade." And so transformation is indeed a process, ongoing, difficult, messy, and uncomfortable. And so it is clear that in our society, the ANC alone, some may say, cannot at all fix it. And so we must, divided as we are, take on that task. Already we have seen what I think are green shoots within our society after the Zuma years and leading up to the end of the Zuma years. Zuma has fallen, but that is not enough. Citizen activism has been an important and decisive part of South Africa's democracy and our constitutional order. It has been seen in the protests against secrecy, against the venal use of apartheid-era legislation like the National Key Points Act, and in pushing for transparency on matters like party funding, in protesting against state capture, and in thousands of smaller, typically unrecorded assertions of the right of citizens to be taken seriously when faced with official arrogance, dishonesty, or indifference. We can take deep comfort in this. And so the question we have to ask ourselves today is, what is the work for us to do? That is both an individual and a collective question for each of us. In his final speech to the United Nations, Barack Obama said, "It turns out that building accountable institutions is hard work, the work of generations. The gains are often fragile. Sometimes we take one step forward and then 2 steps back. So those of us who believe in democracy need to speak out." Challenge for us today. He starts from the premise of respectful conversations that shift the center away from politics away from the politicians. Boyd argues for a renegotiation of common life. The creation of so-called free spaces is essential to the notion of citizens organizing themselves. Boyd, together with his colleague Sarah Evans, relies on the model which was at work in America in the 1960s. During the civil rights movement, civic spaces were reimagined in venues ranging from churches to beauty parlors. And Boyd champions the notion of broad-based community organization in colleges and in other spaces, with citizens as co-creators with the state and not only as passive voting fodder every 5 years. Unfortunately, some of our notions of citizenship today is largely passive. Citizens receiving government services, and they are bestowed rights. The default of the consumer culture, is what Boyd calls it, is that people ask what they can get rather than thinking about what they could build in terms of common resources. Of course, these are American models, but they are parallels that we can draw in South Africa. Are South Africans mature enough, though, to do what Boyd suggests and work across differences to solve common problems, to advance justice and create community wealth from our schools, our public spaces, our libraries, local businesses to art and music, our lifestyles? In the examples he cites, there are educational institutions, teams of young people working on real-world issues, campaigning against bullying, racism, sexual harassment, gang violence, teen pregnancy, championing healthy lifestyles and making curriculum changes. In South Africa, Equal Education has done similar work with students, governing bodies, and school management and parents, aimed at creating safer environments for all children. These are localized initiatives, and they've been possible because of the mobilization of students and parents. I think it is a model worth extending to other areas of socioeconomic development where the state has abdicated its responsibility. We can build our communities as spaces to which we have an attachment and in which we would like to see change. We all have a stake in the future of such places where we live and where we work, or if we're unemployed. But it takes a shared vision and is best cultivated at local level before moving to the national level where accountability is demanded on different issues. In the Fees Must Fall movement, there were nascent signs of our ability to build the kinds of circles of learning and meaning within universities that are needed for us to talk about thorny issues like decolonization and other areas of concern. But those circles need to be more inclusive for us to reap the real benefits. They also need to be led with increased thoughtfulness because changing curricula, for example, cannot be the sole domain of the few, and one could go on. The Right to Know campaign has also pursued successful campaigns over years with regards to mobile telephone data, something that affects poor people. Their campaign, Data Must Fall, has mobilized the poor in communities where the mobile phone is a crucial means of communication and sending remittances. The right to communicate has thus become reframed as a human right. However, more needs to be done in terms of moving towards a broader, more liberating notion of citizenship as work and co-creating with the state. For that to happen, as I've said before, we need the constitutional education, but also the civic education within our schools. And all sectors of society should be involved in reimagining civic life, including business, which is a key actor. As the World Economic Forum report argued, companies need to see the benefit of defending civic space, which includes the freedom of citizens to organize, speak up, protest against the failings of government. In a 2017 World Economic Forum report, the fraying of the rule of law and declining civic freedoms have become a major global risk for companies. And in South Africa, I think that this means that business too has to recreate its role as citizen, to operate ethically regarding workers' rights, occupational safety, transparent tender processes, and executive pay. In South Africa, Marikana stands as an example in the mining industry, where a company engaged in unsustainable and unethical practices in the way in which employees were both paid and housed. Steinhoff is another. But as the World Economic Forum points out, it is not only business, but civil society that needs to build these pathways between them to protect human rights and find solutions to the challenges that we face. Cyril Ramaphosa has committed his government to re-establishing the social compact between government, business and labour, but it will be hard work. These sectors can no longer work in isolation. This not only envisages Harry Boyd's notion of democratic co-creation with the state, but it also leads to a society which is more resilient in dealing with the turbulence that comes along with living in a deeply unequal society. In a country where trust is broken down between individuals, but between sectors, we need this more than ever before. Even with the recent change of leadership, though many of us feel as if we are in a very particular time of global and local tension. Here we have a window of opportunity, though, I believe, but it will take time and effort. A second chance, which calls for the very opposite of despair, for greater mobilization and a true awakening of civic activism for progressive values and corruption-free societies to thrive. As Cody Keenan wrote in his recent essay on the resist movement in the United States, history is made every day by the hopeful. Or as Adrian Rich has written, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And so, despite the complexity of the present and the future, I believe that a degree of hope still glimmers for us here at the southernmost tip of Africa, this place of the second chance. But there is much work to be done, and for that, the centre has to hold. Thank you.
While we are an unequal society, that doesn't mean that we have to stay that way. What are we doing differently to ensure that we fix South Africa? Like our first speaker, our respondent, Lindiwe Mazibuko, is also a graduate of the University of Cape Town. Lindiwe, the stage is yours.
I hope I don't interfere with any of these. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for giving a shout out to our alma mater, the University of Cape Town. It is truly an honor to be here today and to have been invited to provide a response to Judith February's lecture, honoring the legacy of one of our democracy's most celebrated forefathers, the late Ahmed Kathrada, or Uncle Kathy, as he so generously allowed us to call him. I'm also very happy to be here today to share with you my thoughts on a subject which occupies my mind and my work on a daily basis, the future of public leadership in South Africa. Judith has spoken extensively about, possibly even excessively, about civic and citizen leadership. I'd like to supplement that essential input by discussing the crisis in political and government leadership in South Africa today. At the end of November 2018, the first cohort of Apolitical Academy Public Service Fellows will travel to Robben Island for the weekend to participate in one of the first of 7 weekend seminars which are devoted to developing their capacity, their empathy, and their engagement as future public sector leaders across the political, ideological, and institutional spectrum. They've been selected from over 250 extraordinary young leaders from around Southern Africa who applied for the program, having expressed a deep interest in serving the citizens of their country as political or government leaders. The program will be run by Apolitical Foundation, a non-profit, non-partisan organization which I lead, and which has been established in partnership and through collaboration with some of the most extraordinary leaders and leadership organizations in the Southern Africa region, including the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Organizations which are committed to the principle of developing the next generation of ethical public leaders in our region, from party political leaders across the ideological spectrum to government and government institution leaders, the future custodians of our Constitution and the rule of law. Indeed, our public leadership program draws extensive inspiration from the leadership shown by Uncle Kathy throughout his life and from his own commitment to supporting and developing young leaders in South Africa, regardless of their political affiliation. Ahmed Kathrada led no fewer than 300 visits to Robben Island in his lifetime. More than 300. To a place where he was confined for 18 hellish years. A place with such a dark history, it stirs viscerally the emotions of even the briefest of visitors. Such was Uncle Kathy's commitment to young people in this country. Such was his commitment to leadership. Before he passed away in March last year, Ahmed Kathrada expressed a deep desire to take the 2 young leaders of South Africa's biggest opposition parties, Mmusi Maimane and Julius Malema, to visit Robben Island as part of his later life's work of making the island a monument to leadership learning and to the triumph of the human spirit against adversity. His commitment to nurturing young leadership in politics and government in South Africa was unfailing, even to the last. It is a tragedy that he didn't live to see his dream come true, although the Kathrada Foundation, alongside former island inmates and prominent leaders in South Africa, including President Kgalema Motlanthe, Barbara Hogan, and the Honorable Mosiuoa Lekota, were able to take up the mantle on Uncle Kathy's behalf. Now, there is an important lesson for all of us embedded in Uncle Kathy's commitment to making Robben Island a center of leadership learning, in his identifying the next generation of dynamic young leaders to offer his support and mentorship to, regardless, again, of their political affiliation, and in his willingness to put himself through enormous psychological and emotional strain again and again and again by revisiting the site and the memories of his unjust imprisonment for the benefit of future leaders. The central question then, which flows from Uncle Kathy's leadership and which faces us today then, is how do we play our own part in nurturing and supporting the next generation of ethical, transformational, people-centered leaders in politics and government in South Africa? For surely we cannot hope to fix what ails our country, what has so eloquently been stated in Judith in her keynote, without a relentless commitment to developing the leaders who will be the custodians and stewards of our ongoing rebuilding effort. Nor can we hope to rely on repeatedly drawing the leading lights of our transition, such as our celebrated former governor of the Reserve Bank, Tito Mboweni, out of what is their well-earned retirement and then pressing them back into public service again and again, when what they have surely earned is the opportunity to take their leave from the public stage, to pass the baton of leadership on to a committed core of young leaders who will succeed them. Judith, as a former classics student at UCT, I was particularly interested in the fact that you elected to interpret the decay that is being endured by South Africa today and the suffering it's bequeathed on our people in the forms of grinding poverty, unemployment, and hopelessness, that you chose to interpret it through the lens of antiquity and the late Roman Republic. However imperfect and unequal that political system was, there are indeed many parallels to be drawn from the rot that took hold of one of Western civilization's earliest democracies, as the principle of government by the people was replaced with a ruthless dictatorship. I would like to respond to Judith's very apposite comparison from the past by using a perhaps more prosaic but very future-focused example from the present. An example which is from a field about which I know a great deal less than I know about the late Roman Republic, but whose modern sensibilities may give us a clue about the direction in which ethical and people-centered public leadership should go and must go in order to rescue the South African state from its present decay. I've often likened the experience and the privilege of having been a young political and public leader during my time as a Member of Parliament in South Africa to being present and partially responsible for a vast and incomplete construction project. The blueprints are elegant and methodical, designed by the forefathers and mothers of our democracy, emulated and celebrated throughout the world. But the buildings themselves and the infrastructure are incomplete. Their most valuable elements, porcelain, electrical fittings, and copper pipes, have been stolen by construction project managers more interested in self-enrichment than in supporting and completing a most noble project. And we young leaders have been handed the plans. We've been walked over to this dysfunctional and crumbling site and told, finish the job, kid. So how do we identify who best can finish the job? And how might they do so? In modern design and architecture, there's a theory which is increasingly being applied to a range of other academic disciplines as an elegant methodology for complex problem solving. It's colloquially known as design thinking, and it utilizes elements from the designer's toolkit, like empathy and experimentation, to arrive at innovative solutions to some of the most complex and intractable challenges, both technical and policy-based and institutional, that our world faces today. Tim Brown, who's the CEO of the San Francisco-based firm IDEO, where the first ever manufacturable computer mouse was designed for Apple computers, has described design thinking as a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for success. At the center of this method are 5 linear and then circular stages, which have most prominently been proposed by the Hasso-Platter Institute of Design at Stanford University in the United States. The 5 stages are empathize, number 1, empathize. Number 2, define. Number 3, ideate. Number 4, prototype. And number 5, test. The first step, empathizing, is about defining the challenge in human terms, about coming closer to the site of the challenges that people face, be they poverty, unemployment, or inequality, by engaging people rather than numbers, and understanding the human experience at the center of the challenges that most dog our nation. The second stage, define, is about having empathized with the people, figuring out what those core challenges are, asking people for their own interpretation of what they are. The third stage, ideate, is about thinking outside the box or the existing frame. In the realm of politics and government, that may include thinking beyond ideological divides, thinking beyond the divide between, say, non-profit and public service, or trade union and political party. Fourth, prototype. Prototypes exist in government already. But a prototype is meant to be small and inexpensive, an example of what the final product might look like. We have environmental impact assessments and pilot projects, but a real prototype is inexpensive, it's scaled down, and it's an experiment that enables us to accept or reject the proposed solution. And finally, test. Testing requires rigor. Testing is to take the idea, the change, the implementation into the field, and then go back and redefine the challenge, re-empathize, and repeat the process in its entirety. If we think about the state of our nation today as a construction site gone bad, a set of elegant plans with poor implementation, theft, and a lack of resources to complete the job, then surely we can also find the solutions to this challenge in the idea that we must empathize with the people for whom the solutions are meant, that we must define the challenge, ideate and engage people from across sectors in order to find solutions, prototype those solutions inexpensively and regularly, and finally test and retest and retest. Ahmed Kathrada himself said, "It's up to the next generation to deepen our democracy, to defend our constitution, to eradicate poverty, to eliminate inequality, and to fight corruption." Our task today is to find the leaders in that next generation who are up to the task, who can think through new and innovative ways to solve the complex problems either that their forefathers left them with or which are part of the systemic inequalities that have dogged our country for generations. I've spoken a lot today about the next generation of leaders in our country, but the key takeaway from my response should not simply be that we need more young leaders in politics and government simply because youth leadership automatically equals better, more ethical, and more accountable leadership. It does not. In fact, if the scandal surrounding the flagrant looting of the people's hard-earned money from VBS Mutual Bank has taught us anything, it's that excellence may be distributed across generations and political organizations. But in today's post-state capture world, so too are corruption and unethical leadership distributed across generations and political organizations. So, supporting the next generation of public leaders is not only about preparing for the future. It's about changing the narrative on public service in our country, from a narrative of self-enrichment, self-interest, and self-centered decision-making to one of competence, compassion, and commitment to improving the lives and the livelihoods of the citizens we have been called to serve. I thank Uncle Kathy and the foundation which bears his legacy and his name for leading the way on this crucial journey. And today, I hope we may all commit ourselves to the long-term, difficult, but essential work of preparing today's younger generation for the work of ethical and transformational leadership, both today and into the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks, Lindiwe, and thanks, Delani, as well. Now, we're not going to have the normal question and answer session. What we're really going to have are your thoughts on what needs to be done to fix South Africa. So, there's going to be a set of mics going around. And I'm asking each of you who want to make a contribution to really preface it by saying, to fix South Africa, I think we should do, and then elaborate in 1 minute what you think needs to be done. Please, I'm really appealing that we're not going to repeat the length of the lectures through your contributions. You're going to keep it to 1 minute, and you're going to say what you think needs to be done. Thereafter, we will ask our speakers to respond to your thoughts and suggestions and ideas. Now, I'm also told that some of you are here gathering information for manifestos, so this might be a useful platform as well. For free, take the ideas if they're useful into your political parties. Right, there's a set of mics. Can I just say who's got, there's one that side and that side? Telanic onto that side.